You were born in Colima, Mexico, and you grew up in Modesto, California. You have published essays, academic work, and two main poetry collections. Other Countries with What Books in 2010, and The Chronicles with Red Hen Press in 2015. In these two books, there are multiple references to suburbia. I wrote down some lines like the sun grips the suburbs, I am out of in the suburban streets, the tedious nights of the suburbs. There is a poem about Walt Whitman in the suburbs. There is also a description, you say, my innocent suburban Catholic Mexican boy eyes. So suburbia is more than a landscape, as they say, it's like a character. Who is this suburbia, and why is suburbia so present in your poetry?
Because I grew up in Modesto, California, and it's primarily agricultural, the Central Valley, but the suburbs are very present. I grew up right in the middle of the suburbs, so it was just lawns, and I played baseball as a kid, and so it's a very familiar landscape. But it's also a landscape that I think has been underrepresented in American poetry. I mean, there are poets who write about the suburbs, but it's not as prevalent as we would think, because I mean, that is America, the suburbs. And it's also, I find it interesting. I find there's so many things there that we take for granted or don't look at.
But in some poems you long for it, you long for suburbia.
Well, I think it's my real country. I mean, I think that's where I spent the most time, where, my formative years were spent in that landscape. So to me, it's a whole country. I mean, I lived in Mexico the first 6 years of my life. That's very important. That's, the Freudian years there. But after that, it was, before I went to college, that was my life. It was my world. That was my entire world, the suburbs.
The suburbia streets.
Yeah. And back then it was very, Modesto was just very Mexican and very white. It's changed somewhat, but it was much quieter back then. There were no gangs. It was kind of more pastoral or idyllic in a weird American way. Okay. So I think it belongs in those classical traditions too, of a landscape, as you say, and it does have a character. It definitely has very singular characteristics, and that's what attracts me. What could be unique about it? Because we see it as the most banal kind of, places you don't want to stay for very long in. Yeah. And I felt that way for a long time. But now I see it as an interesting landscape to explore, to inhabit, and to write about.
So talking about suburbia, why don't you read one of the poems from Other Countries? It's called Summer.
Summer. The sun grips the suburbs through the air-conditioned hours. Time waits suspended when mom is working the afternoon shift at the cannery. Dad has come home from work and is asleep on the couch. The television is on, sounding unwatched images. There are bicycles that have been ridden to exhaustion, baseball games long ended, the smell of peeled mangoes and peaches, disco songs on the radio. Life was awful in a wondrous way, in the unnameable misery of childhood that knows no sorrow and stays forever in place.
Was poetry part of your childhood?
I was going to respond no, but I think it really was.
In which way?
I grew up very Catholic, very Mexican Catholic, so going to church on Sundays, and then catechism, and then I was an altar boy. That's, I think, a very distinct, dramatic culture. And there's a lot of poetry in that, the rituals, the visual aspects of it. And then, of course, the liturgy, what you read in church.
The language itself.
The language of the Bible was my first exposure to poetry.
And when did you take poetry more seriously as a writer?
When I was in high school, and not in my English classes. I didn't have good teachers, or very encouraging teachers. But there were a couple of used bookstores in Modesto at the time. Now there's just one. And somehow I wandered into them and
what did you see?
I somehow discovered Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath and Pasolini's The Roman Poems, and Walt Whitman.
Well, what a beginning.
Yeah, actually I got lucky. I think it was great first exposure. In class we were reading Shakespeare and Arthur Miller, and that marked my childhood too, but I couldn't at that age identify as much as, you know, Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. I just loved. She was really angry and wanted out, you know, in more ways than one. So I could, in my, you know, very naive Mexican boy way, kind of identify with that.
Like without a guidance, without a guide, nobody told you about it. You just walk in the store and you encounter them. Wow.
Yeah, I think I just started reading poetry on my own, and it changed my world because I needed something. I wasn't into sports at that point, and I didn't like high school, and maybe I was bored, or I just needed something to imagine something else.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's very imaginative literature. I mean, the metaphors, the mythology, the world that is in those poets definitely marked me. And I still read them, you know.
In your poetry, there's a lot of attention to marginalized characters, drug users, adolescents who are bullied. But I also wonder if there is a version of you that is forgotten or could have been forgotten. I'm talking about the poem The Two Childhoods.
Yeah, I think, you know, we're part of a history and a community, whether we live in that history or that community anymore, it's part of us. And to me, it's not nostalgia. I don't look at it nostalgically. I look at it as, like a chronicle to go back and recover and to reimagine things that were lost. There's so much loss in our communities. I mean, that's the reality. And it's a way of getting to know our history and where we belong and how to understand, you know, where we're at now. I think it's very important to look, to examine the past and to examine oneself.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't see it as so individualistic. I mean, obviously it is when I'm writing it, because I want it to be very much singular and autobiographical, and even confessional to a certain extent. But I'm very aware of the fact that it's not just my history, that it's the history of many, many people that don't appear in the history books, don't appear. Or when they do, they appear as kind of mythological creatures, which is interesting too. I mean, I am interested in those also, and maybe giving those creatures a voice in a way. Those are the marginalized, sort of outcasts, pariahs. I mean, obviously there's an identification with those of marginalization, but I try to make it imaginative and not so documentary.
Yeah, that's a fine line to walk in or to walk on. Like on one side the journalistic eye, but also on the other side the poet eye, the more imaginative and
Yeah, actually the journalistic eye doesn't really interest me much. Maybe the historical aspect of it does, but the journalistic not really. The poetic part, yes, because I think there's a lot of poetry there that we have not written about. In the suburbs, our history, what we could imagine and not what is just there, you know, because we let the journalists do that, with all respect to my journalist friends, you know. But I think as poets, I think our responsibility, or traditionally has been to write about those things that have not been written about, or that people don't want to write about or look at.
Yeah. Do you mind reading the poem The Two Childhoods from the Chronicles?
The Two Childhoods. I remember a boy mesmerized by white butterflies, giant white petals riding the winds, kite-like, through the still bright hours of interchangeable afternoons in the town he was to leave. Other things I remember: the plaza at night, cobblestone streets, Christ naked bleeding inside the cold 19th century cathedral, the wimples of the nuns at school, rivers, forests, fields, afternoon funerals of men killed in the dimness of the surrounding mountains, the penis of an older boy neighbor masturbating in the haystacks, scorpions, lizards. Orville Wright Elementary School, the block letters of the alphabet lined atop the classroom's chalkboard, the tedious nights of the suburbs, longing for the animated darkness of Cuelcoman, peopled with devils, ghosts, legends, the disemboweled sky. There will be a self-evident death, ending quite matter-of-factly what I have made of the Modesto suburbs and the cities lived in and traveled through. And there is the other death that would have been mine if I had not left a Mexico grown foreign to this other life that became who I am.
That ending is unbelievable.
Thank you.
It's fantastic. Elizabeth Horan writes about your book, Other Countries, and she talks about the myth of the good son, or the myth of the promising child of Mexican immigrants. And how can you expand this idea of achievement and disappointment?
Well, I was a scholarship boy, obviously, and it was the only way to get out of the suburbs, too. And of course, in a very traditional Mexican family, Catholic, you have no choice but to be the good boy or the bad boy, and I couldn't quite do that. So you fell into that role. But interestingly, I was always, when I read the Bible as a kid, I was always interested in the evil characters.
And there are plenty.
There are more than enough. Plenty to keep a young boy's imagination kind of reeling. In Mexico as a kid, I learned to read from the nuns. And I used to ask a lot of questions, not about, the angels and things, but the devils and the Jezebels and etc. And I always loved the story of the prodigal son. I don't know how much I identify with it, to tell you the truth. It just is such a strange, melancholy story. And Rilke says that it's a story about a man that doesn't want to be loved. That never made any sense to me. Perhaps it does to other people who read the story of the prodigal son. I still don't understand why Rilke said that, but to me, I don't know what it's about. Maybe that's why I can't let it go and I keep writing about it, because it's such a primal story about leaving home and unable to come back to a certain extent, but longing for it. And that longing for a home, I think it's universal, obviously, but it has, I think, a very particular characteristics in the kind of world that we live in, where there's so much displacement, there's so much marginalization, so much misunderstanding within families and within communities, and it's just a beautiful story.
Let's talk about one of the title of one of your books, the Chronicles, and this is a question about tone, and because in Chronicles there is, I think there is a sense of truth, and you achieve that very well in your poems. There is a solid sense of truth. But I want you to talk a little bit about, or as much as you want, about the use of language to achieve that tone of truth or chronicle.
Well, I mean, starting with the title, the Chronicles, I like language that suggests various interpretations and meanings. Not necessarily ambiguity, but language that is suggestive, metaphoric, etc. The Chronicles, of course, comes from the Chronicles of the Nueva España, the New World. So just at more basic levels, it's chronicling those stories, the landscapes that have not been represented or have not been accurately represented, perhaps. It also, the Velvet Underground and the Chronicles. I just like the sound of it, and what it suggested about the fictionalizing history and seeing fairy tales, stories from the Bible, mythical characters from fairy tales and rock and roll and movie stars as all part of a world that is its own history, its own very localized history in California and between Mexico and the United States. So it has a historical kind of suggestion, at least that's what I was aiming at.
But it's also very personal, because you also mentioned before this concept of being almost confessional.
Yeah, and I like the confessional poets very much. I mean, not when it's too...
Yeah.
No one wants to hear about that. My therapist does. But you know what I mean? Like the confessional that gets at the root of one's existential crisis, because that can be very particular and very mythologized too. And I like that sort of border between the autobiographical and the mythical, and how we can fit a lot of the mythical characters from literature and the Bible, and in our own culture too, in pop culture also.
In your poems, even though they have that chronicle vibe, but there is this intimacy that you are part of that territory. Well, as a reader, you are very much into that territory. It's very private.
Yeah, I think there, I aim at honesty, and the particular, very, very singular. I think we all have very singular experiences in intimacy, and whatever those experiences are, I just aim to imagine them and to present them in a language that is, that is suggestive, that it's metaphoric, and.
Yeah. One more thing about the marginalized characters in your books. Could you talk about? Let me see if I can pronounce this properly. Can you talk about rascuache? If that aesthetic has anything to do with the representation of these characters?
Not deliberately.
Okay.
I think...
How will you define... I don't know how to define it properly. How will you define rascuache?
Oh, it's kind of something that's like half-made, that's not professional, that's kind of just
low...
kitsch and tacky something.
Okay.
But just not aiming at, high anything. So it can be interesting for a little bit, And of course it finds itself into my poetry because it can be beautiful too. And it's not, I wouldn't see it as camp, it's not sort of recovering something kitsch and making it sophisticated. I think that there is a world out there that it can be kind of half-made or, kind of very informal.
And has value in itself.
And has a beauty and a value, definitely, in itself. And, I'm very attracted to the ordinary and how that can be mythologized or made into something grand. Because I think that exists, and some great poetry does that too. Even in mythologizing our very intimate experiences that, documenting them, of course, it's more memoir or autobiographical. But if the mythological and the strange, the demonic, whatever can enter that, then it becomes much more poetic, I think, and fascinating.
You have an essay about the photographer Ricardo Valverde. I think the book is called Ricardo Valverde.
Yeah.
You also have collaborated with Luis Jacinto in a book that is about Los Angeles. I think it's called M.I. Los Angeles, is that right?
There's a lot of great artists in LA, and I've been privileged enough to know them and to work with some of them. I've also worked with Sandra de la Loza and Susan Silton on a very interesting conceptual project that she did about artists who have committed suicide. And, there's several others. I just like collaborations, and I like the visual arts, and when interesting things present themselves, to me it's hard to say no, except for the time limitations, as you know.
Yeah. You also have collaborated with Terry Wolverton, is that right?
Yeah.
You did, how is it called?
Disarticulations.
Disarticulations. How did that project start with Terry?
I took a workshop with her years ago, and we became friends, and then I took her yoga classes. She's a great yoga instructor. And then she's collaborated with many poets on disarticulations. And then she's edited many books. She's edited many anthologies of poetry.
Recently, the journal Círculo de Poesía has published 6 of your poems in Spanish, translated by Andrea Rivas. You are a Spanish speaker, but you don't write in Spanish, is that right? I mean,
That's
you
correct.
use Spanish sometimes, but you don't write in Spanish.
Not yet. That could change.
I was going to ask you that question.
I'm hoping that I'm open for it to change. I do read in Spanish. I just choose not to write in Spanish. I feel more able, more comfortable in writing in English.
Were you tempted to translate your own work?
Actually, don't have much interest in that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very thankful for translators, and it's such a great service that they do. And I've only have done it once. I've translated a few poems of Thomas Segovia
into English.
Into English for Mandora.
Okay.
And I found out how much work it is and how difficult. I mean, it's interesting work, but it's very involved, and you want to really do justice to the poem. So it's a big responsibility too.
Yeah.
And I would be more interested in translating from Spanish to English. That I actually will probably do in the near future.
So let's end with a poem that is in this publication in Círculo de Poesía. You read it. You read the title in English, and then
you'll read the Spanish.
Yes. So this is your poem in English, and then the translation is by
Andrea Rivas.
Andrea Rivas.
Alejandra Pizarnik writes a poem for Janis Joplin. Sing sweetly and die after. No, Macbeth's weird sisters agree. Inside every Buddhist is an aborted rock star trapped in the hotel rooms of meditation that rock and roll didn't destroy. Sing savagely and live after. No, Blake's angels agree. But then again, They are silent. Listen to them.
And this is the Spanish version. Alejandra Pizarnik escribe un poema para Janis Joplin. Canta con dulzura y muere después. No, las brujas de Macbeth coinciden. Dentro de cada budista está el aborto de una estrella de rock, atrapada en las habitaciones del hotel de la meditación que en rock and roll no destruyó. Canta salvaje y vive después. No, los ángeles de Blake coinciden, pero de nuevo están en silencio. Escúchalos. Thank you, Ramón.
Thank you.